So I think it's time now to move on to a question and answer session. So right before the break, we will have a break right after, but now it's time to a bit of connection, a bit of interaction between you as an attendees and our speakers. Unfortunately, we cannot leave the floor to the attendees directly, but I have a selection of the questions you have asked through the chat, and I will be your voice at this time. So for Jan Davos, first question. Jan, are you here?
Yes,
so,
sorry.
First question from Gabriele Lombardi. What is the position of EFSA towards the distinction between GMOs and CRISPR-engineered crops? Are the risks comparable? Quite difficult question, Jan, for you.
Well, it's a tricky one. And the easy answer is to refer to the regulator and the decision makers, policy makers. So they have decided that in Europe, these type of crops should be considered GMOs. In other jurisdictions, they took another stance. So they have not regulated these crops, and they argued that no regulatory oversight was needed for these type of crops. So it really depends on the legal context in which you operate, on whether they will be considered a GMO or not. So that's really on a case-by-case basis. And in terms of a risk assessment, what EFSA already mentioned before is that some of the data requirements that are applicable for a standard GMO, GM plant, would not necessarily be applicable for those type of crops because of the nature of the changes introduced. So if we talk about SDN1 and 2, I mean, these are mutational changes, so it's very precise. It's little change. And for sure, there are a number of data requirements that would be relaxed for those cases. And I think we have issued opinions that are addressing that point. So I hope that this clarifies the picture a bit in Europe. And Europe is a bit an outsider with the position taken so far. So that's true.
Thank you very much. The second one that is tricky as well is from Piotr Ogrodovich. Sorry if I don't pronounce the name in the correct way. I will do my best. So the question is, it seems to me that the key element of the risk assessment is the acceptable risk. How do you define it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's a very challenging point because it's a normative decision. So it involves the decision makers, the regulators, the risk managers. And in some cases, they define what is being acceptable, yes or not. And then it's clear for the risk assessor what you need to do because they have defined a frame in which you can operate and you know, okay, this level of change has been considered acceptable or not. So I need to operate in those boundaries. But in other cases, it's not defined that clearly. So the risk assessor ends up sometimes deciding what is an acceptable risk or not at lower levels in the risk assessment itself. So that's a bit of a challenge. In GMOs, for instance, what we do is that we follow a comparative approach. So we compare the GMO with conventional agriculture. We assume that conventional agriculture is the acceptable baseline as it is today. So if the GMO and the practices linked to it are not more harmful than what we accept today, then for us, it's fine. So in that sense, you perform a comparative analysis. Another way to handle it is to move towards a type of absolute risk assessment. And there you would say, okay, 10% change in that endpoint. For instance, honeybee population would not be acceptable or not. And that can be derived based on scientific considerations. You would consider recovery or the resilience of your system and also the normal operating range, etc., and these kind of things. And I think Domenica already alluded to the type of considerations they put forward with the risk quotients and these kind of endpoints, trigger values that they have in mind. But defining what is acceptable, by default, it's a normative consideration. So it's something that needs to be decided in agreement with society decision makers, risk managers, and once they agree on what is acceptable, you can perform your risk assessment according to those standards. Because often we realize that people disagree on what is an acceptable risk, and that's why some of our assessments are not being supported by all representatives of the society, and that's because they would want more data to come to a conclusion, or they might not want to accept that level of uncertainty. So it really deserves dialogue. Hope this helps. Thank you. Good questions.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you. So I think we have some very good questions also for Domenica and Agnes. So I think we can move on to Domenica. This one is quite challenging as well, and I can help you telling that part of this question will be addressed tomorrow, probably from the first speaker, or let me say, I'm sure that the first speaker will address this part. So be patient. Anyway, this comes from Marco Hatem Vaquero, and the question is, Paracelsus' concept, dose makes the poison, referring to individual substances, is one of the classic toxicology maxims. However, I think taking into account the cocktail effect should be a critical point too. So my question is, how is this effect being addressing in the studies in order to determine the LD50 or the NOED, of course, in terms of pesticides and bee health?
Yes, thank you. The guidance document on bees, but also the other guidance document for the other target organism in relation to pesticide, to consider the possibility to address the risk for mixture, but still with a limited, let's say, consideration, and the limitation is given by the regulation itself, because the regulation is meant to, let's say, bring individual substances to the approval or non-approval, or product to the approval and non-approval. In this context, in our guidance document, we consider the possibility of addressing the toxicity of a mixture when there are, which are meant like formulation with more than one active substance, and normally it considers the additive toxicity. But equally, we could, in our approach, we are also giving indication on considering a synergistic effect of those mixture. The same can be applied to tank mix that are normally formed before, let's say, at the moment of the use. But the regulation does not cover let's say, the mixture that are formed in the environment, in the environmental matrices, following the use of different chemicals, so not only pesticide. This is an issue, and is the issue that actually we are aware of, and for which we are moving towards a system-based approach. The needs are to first getting measured data, so the monitoring data, or so how many residues are, for example, in pollen and nectar, regardless of the source of those residues, and then also having a methodology for cumulative risk assessment. So what are for example, the combination of the leading to synergistic effect or just to additive effect, and all these aspects are, let's say, in our planning for the future, because there is a need, and it is not only EFSA, not the actor, because there are also many other actors playing a role, but the need is to develop cumulative risk assessment methodology from one side, but also put in place fit-for-purpose monitoring schemes allowing to collect data for this risk assessment. So once we arrive there, it is clear that this will form the background also for the risk assessment of individual substances. So we can do a predictive risk assessment by considering as a background what is the let's say what is the reality, what is the contamination in the agricultural landscapes.
Thank you very much, Domenica. So now I got a question that is for both you and Agnes. It's quite interesting because it addresses transparency, which is one of the topics that is really important for the risk assessors in general and for EFSA in particular. So the question comes from Elena Zioga, and she asked, I know that the PPP industry, so the pesticides industry, is obliged to perform similar risk assessment studies for bees. I was wondering, is EFSA able to have access and see not only the results, but the whole process of these studies? And why isn't the outcome of these studies available to the public and academia? I know it's quite complicated.
No, I may start. It's quite easy actually, because obviously we have access to all the data. So not only the study report, but the raw data that have been produced in any experiment. This is mandatory, and we cannot. Well, it's true that the first evaluation is done by the rapporteur, who is the responsible for checking this, but also EFSA has access to this data, and we can check that every time is needed. And I want to say that with the transparency regulation, all the study reports will be made public available. So this is already a reality. And so I don't know if Agnes want to add on this.
No, I think you are better placed, Domenica, to answer such a question. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I think that probably not all the attendees are aware of the transparency regulation and all the new EFSA Connect websites. So probably that's why many people still don't know how to retrieve this kind of information. Maybe this is something we can address also in the afternoon, if possible, but we will discuss it later. Agnes, for you, Pradeep Kumar just asked, he knows that there are other pollinator insects as well. So why the studies are focused primarily on bees, and if he's also asking if there is any other program or research covering other pollinators as well.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you for asking this question. I think this is very relevant, and we are aware that, yes, of course, there are also the wild pollinators and the wild bees, and we focused on honeybees. This was initially a pragmatic decision, because when we started in 2015, so that's already 6 years ago, we already acknowledged the lack of data for wild bees and wild pollinators, and to make it go through, we wanted to start with honeybees, because this is where we have the evidence. So we built up the approach on honeybees. However, the idea is to expand to wild pollinators by adapting the approach, the philosophy, the concept to wild bees, acknowledging that, of course, this will require further development, in particular regarding the modeling approach, but also the monitoring, because we will not monitor the same the same indicators if it's a social being living in a colony, like I mentioned, the sentinel hives. If we are monitoring wild bees, we will have to do differently with different methods, different indicators. So in that respect, the European Commission is currently, launching this very ambitious monitoring scheme that is under the EU Pollinator Initiative. and this will cover other types of insect pollinators and bees than honeybees. In addition, as I mentioned, but towards the end of my presentation, very rapidly, we will develop at EFSA new activities. And this is starting with designing a roadmap on how to identify the partners with whom we will be working on this topic, because there are many people out there working on wild bees that we want to associate. And as I said, we will develop the approach to insect pollinators. Regarding the project, yes, European Commission is also funding several H2020 projects on the topics. And I mentioned two. One of them is on also wild bees, so poche bee, but there are more projects ongoing. So yes, this is something that we need to keep an eye and integrate in the system-based approach that we are proposing.
Thank you very much.
For the lady who has the question, there is a link also to the scientific opinion that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. And there is in the opinion a table on the new upcoming data development that will serve the system-based approach for wild bees. So I direct this person to this opinion. And maybe, I don't know if Domenica wants to add something, or Jan, but this is what I would finish.
Thank you very much, Agnes. So I think we are running out of time. Now there's a break, so 10 minutes time is definitely needed for a coffee and a short break. But before leaving, I just want to say that all the questions will be collected, and all the answers will be published together with the presentation on the EFSA website and will be accessible to all the attendees. So later on, all your doubts will be covered, no worries. So thank you very much for now. We will come back at 11:30 after a short break. Thank you again.